As a mortality demographer, I study heavy questions, literal matters of life and death. But the most difficult part of my work is figuring out precisely what question to pursue. When I'm in the grip of one of these intellectual puzzles, the way I make progress is by coming back to the data over and over again, relentlessly, until something finally clicks and I understand it by seeing it in a new way. The question I asked myself in my most recent study is how the catastrophic scale of death due to the COVID-19 pandemic compares to another U.S. catastrophe, racial inequality. I discovered that even if Black Americans had been immune to the coronavirus, their mortality this year would probably still be higher than white mortality during the pandemic. Once we see that racial inequality means a pandemic's worth of death to Black Americans every single year, it should change the way we think about fighting racism. When we consider ideas like reparations or defunding the police, our questions should shift from what's politically palatable to just what will work. I'm a demographer. Traditionally, demography is about births, deaths, and migrations, but really what that means is it's about who's in the population. I study death, and part of why that is so interesting to me is that it's something that is so intrinsic to what our lives are like. It matters so much how long we live, but it's also something that you can count. It's numerical. And that juxtaposition between something that is so essentially human, but also so countable and mathematical. I think the interplay between those is really interesting to me. I stumbled into demography. The first demographic methods class that I took, I thought was so boring. It was all these methods for counting, and I thought this is just a bunch of accounting tricks, like Excel tricks. I don't like this at all. I'm never doing this again. And I put it aside for a couple of years. And then in order to get some skills that I needed for a project, I took a more advanced class. And I suddenly realized that I had been completely wrong and that demographic methods actually give you this really flexible framework for understanding social inequality and social change. And once I understood it that way, I was hooked. For me, the kind of research I'm doing now started a couple of years ago when I had a discovery that I was not expecting. So some collaborators and I were doing this project on infectious disease mortality in the early 20th century. And we were looking at regional differences because we thought that this was going to give us some way to understand some big debates about why did infectious diseases decline so much? Was it public health? Was it nutrition? Was it something different? So we found these big regional differences where basically the South looks way worse than everywhere else for a really long time. And we were starting to write up this story, and then we started looking specifically by race. And we realized that what we had seen as a regional story was actually a story about race. It was about racial inequality that was not just in the South, but everywhere in the United States. And the thing we found that really floored us was that in the 1918 flu pandemic, which is kind of off the charts mortality, white mortality in that pandemic was less than what Black mortality had been every single year prior. And so we found this result, and we at first did not believe it. We assumed we had made a mistake. In my field, we talk about the 1918 flu as this completely unique and unprecedented event. And so realizing that that was actually the typical experience for African Americans it was hard to even fathom. So we checked the data a million different ways, and every way we looked at it, we got the same result. And so finally, we realized this is really true. And that really changed the way that I think about mortality. So that was the context for me having the question this past spring, is it possible that that would be true in the coronavirus pandemic as well? Is it possible that even in the middle of this pandemic, white mortality could be less than Black mortality has been in recent years in the United States. And I was stunned to find that that is true. The 1918 flu is a really interesting contrast case to the coronavirus. There are some things that are so similar. So cities had to decide, what are we going to do in the face of this airborne disease that is killing on this unprecedented scale? And so they adopted policies that are similar to a lot that we've done today. They did school closures. They quarantined people. They shut down lots of theaters and restaurants to keep people from being in close quarters together. Among other kinds of reforms, in New York City, they forced businesses that stayed open to stagger their schedules so that there was no rush hour where people would be all crowded together in transit. And so cities had these strategies, and just like now, these strategies were actually incredibly controversial. So I have a project where some students and I were looking at newspaper clippings from the 1918 flu, and it was amazing reading these denunciations of the autocracy of the health departments that were not allowing people to mingle freely. It feels so familiar to some of the debates that are happening today. Some other things were different. So a lot of my research is about racial inequality in mortality, and there the 1918 story is very different from the coronavirus story. This pandemic has been marked by really extreme racial inequality in who is getting sick and who's dying, and that has a lot to do with things like who is an essential worker in the United States. The 1918 flu was different from that. It happened in a context where there was very extreme inequality in almost every year, where blacks were at much higher risk than whites across the board. And then the pandemic was almost an exception to that, where the Black and white death rates were surprisingly equal. I'm part of a research team that is trying to unravel why that was right now. We have some really interesting hypotheses that have to do with the way that exposure to prior flus might have actually ended up being protective in this case. But I think the lesson that I take from that is that what happens in a pandemic reflects all the things that were happening beforehand, all the social inequalities, all the prior exposures to other diseases. It tells you something about the society, but it doesn't do it in this kind of obvious or universal way. It's mediated by the specific biology of the specific virus. And there, the details of the 1918 virus compared to this one actually really matter. Demography has a reputation as being a really dry field. And to me, it's not like that at all. The fun of my work is using these very precise quantitative mathematical models to understand really deep things about how inequality works, about what our lives are like. And I love in my teaching when I can get students who are a little bit skeptical about the material to suddenly realize the power of it to speak to things that matter to them. I love teaching, and my favorite classes to teach are the mathy classes. I teach undergrad statistics and graduate population modeling. And the reason I love teaching them is that a lot of my students do not want to be there. They are extremely unhappy, sometimes angry that they have to take a statistics class in order to graduate. And the most fun thing for me is when I've won them over by the end of the semester and they realize, first of all, that they can do this. And second of all, that they want to do it, that it's actually fun and gives them a way to do things that they want to be able to do to answer questions that matter to them. I start off my stats class with a little mini lecture about how everything you know about math people is a lie, because I want to start with an invitation to to embrace the fact that anybody can do statistics, but we get systematically told that only certain kinds of people can do math and only certain kinds of people can do computer programming. And I talk with them about what that has looked like in my own education, getting discouraged in math classes, and then coming back and realizing that I actually really need this in order to be able to do what I want to do, and learning things on my own that I had failed at learning in the context of classes. So it's very fun for me to be able to give my students a better math experience than I had. I specialize in methods that move back and forth between thinking about what's happening to individuals and thinking about what's happening to a whole population. And that's a pretty powerful perspective for being able to take things that we can only really measure at the population level, like mortality. You'd never really know what an individual's mortality risk is because at any given moment, they either die or they don't die. So we only get these richer ideas about risk by looking at a whole population at once. But when you're looking at a population, you're lumping together people who are actually all different from each other. And so this is a kind of intractable problem when it comes to studying something like mortality. And the methods that I specialize in are methods of trying to get at that problem in different creative kinds of ways. My work is forcing us to see the extent of racial inequality in how long we all live. And in a lot of ways, I think we are used to really extreme racial inequality in the United States. It becomes very normalized. We take for granted that white and Black Americans will not have the same experiences in almost any aspect of life. And my research results, I think, sometimes can jolt us, including jolting me, into understanding anew just how much inequality there really is and how much difference that makes. To me, knowing that the scale of racial inequality and mortality is that Black Americans are experiencing the equivalent of a pandemic every single year, it really changes the conversation for me about what we should be doing. So when it comes to COVID, we shut down the world. You know, I'm not saying that we've done everything right or we've done everything we should. I actually wouldn't say that at all. But I do think that it is remarkable the speed at which our assumptions about what we take for granted about the way that our society operates were just upended. All of my assumptions about the way I'm going to do my work and when I'm going to travel and what my daily life will be just went out the window, and I accepted those things might not be true for the next 2 years. And we've had a willingness to do that because we understand that it's essential to stop a really staggering scale of death. And then here we have that same staggering scale of death in the context of racism year in and year out, and the willingness to take action is so much less. When I say that these deaths are because of racism, what I mean is there's always differences. You know, any two groups of people that you choose, they're not going to live the exact same amount of time as each other. But when we talk about Black people and white people in the United States, you're talking about a context where for one group of people, you have systematically put them into the worst neighborhoods, the worst schools, the worst jobs, surrounded by the most pollution, the least control over their time, the very little wealth and income. And then on top of that, you have heaped stigma and discrimination, including in a medical system that often treats patients with suspicion and hostility. You know, when you do all of that and then you look and say like, oh, this group of people isn't living that long, your starting assumption should be, well, that's why. It's because of racism. What I wish everybody would get from my work is to really think about that disjuncture and to think, just to imagine what would it look like if our starting assumption was not things are going to be more or less the same way they are, but with some tweaks around the edges. But if our starting assumption was this inequality is unacceptable and we're going to do whatever it takes to eradicate it, we don't know what that'll be, but that's what our goal is, so let's figure that out. That would be a really different world than the world that we're living in. Most often, I start with a more open-ended question. So, how many deaths will it take to white people in 2020 for white mortality to look like Black mortality does in a normal year when there's no pandemic? It wasn't really a hypothesis that white mortality in the pandemic would still be less than Black mortality always is, even though that's what I ended up finding. I didn't really expect that to be true. I did just want to know the numbers to be able to kind of quantify these two different sources of loss of life. So a lot of my work, when I start a question or start a project, I don't know enough what I'm going to find to have a hypothesis off the bat. It's a more exploratory process of kind of poking around and seeing what patterns are interesting. And that reflects that demography is a very descriptive field. We want to explain things, but first and foremost, we want to actually just describe what is happening. And that's what our tools and our methods are best at. And in a lot of ways, I feel like it doesn't get enough credit. It's much more exciting to be able to say, look, I explained something. But the first step is always to actually just say what's going on. And that's what demography does really well. Way back around the end of May, I was scheduled to talk to a reporter, not about anything to do with everything that was happening in Minnesota then, the uprising after George Floyd was killed, nothing to do with that. It was about historical infectious disease. But I was at a protest for justice for George Floyd, and I had to push back the interview when the protest ran late. And so the reporter knew that that's what I had been doing. And so when I was speaking with her that night, she asked me, well, how do you respond to the idea that these protests are spreading COVID around? And something about that phrasing, that how do you respond, it feels very accusatory. And I realized that if a lot of people get COVID from protesting, that is going to be kind of the narrative that gets told, that it was irresponsible to protest. And it made me angry because I felt like people are protesting because they have no choice. They have tried everything else, and literally people are still killed by police in the street in broad daylight. So what else can you do but protest that? And so that night, I started looking around for data to understand how much lifetime is lost in the United States. And how is that different depending on your race and your gender? So I found data, and I was lucky and actually was able to get data from a great group of researchers, Frank Edwards, Hedwig Lee, and Michael Esposito, who had done an earlier study. And I took their data and asked, what's the lifetime loss? And so what they had done is studied how common is death to police violence in the United States, and their results were staggering. They found that 1 in 1,000 Black men can expect to die of an encounter with the police. And what I added to that was how much of their lives are lost because of that. The answer is, out of every 100,000 Black men that are born, they can expect to collectively lose about 6,000 years of life to police violence in the United States. And so I published that this summer, and to me, it was really a response to that reporter. We now know that it seems that the protests were a lot safer than people, including me, had assumed. They were outdoors. They were almost universally masked. It turns out that that's really protective. We didn't know that in May and June. But we did know that the context that was spurring the protests was really the necessity of saving lives. Studying topics that are painful, like death, the way that I can do it is I sort of bracket off the intellectual problems from the meaning, and I take it piece by piece. So I find the puzzle that I need to solve, and then I just attack that puzzle until it makes sense to me. How am I going to measure this when there's no data that actually measure it? Well, I can link together this piece and that piece and get an idea from that. Or, I find a series of problems that seem intractable, and I figure out how to make them solvable problems. And that work is really engaging, and it's actually fun. But then after I've done that, there comes a point where I have to unbracket and engage again with what have I actually found out. And typically what I have found out is that in the United States, there is a huge amount of death that doesn't need to happen. And so that's a heavy topic. So in the day-to-day of my work, I'm not always confronting head-on what that means. But in the kind of week in, week out, stepping back a little bit from the work with data, that's what my work is actually about. Something people don't expect about me is that I am a power lifter. I find lifting sort of meditative in the way that everybody says that yoga is supposed to be, but it hasn't really been that for me. The weights are so heavy that you have to just lift them. You can't think about anything else while you're lifting. You have to just be paying attention to what you're feeling and the muscle memory and doing the things that you know how to do. And there's not really any room to be overly cognitive about it. And that's something I appreciate, I think. But coming back to what it actually means is really important. So there is a way where it could be very easy in this line of work to never really engage with what's the real meaning of inequalities in mortality. You can just sort of go about measuring things and writing papers and rolling along, and that would not be fulfilling or even really acceptable to me, because what my work is describing is a really unacceptable state of affairs. And I think it matters to have to really think about what that means and to feel it. When I'm starting to understand a project, I usually have no idea what it's actually even about. I might think I know what it's about, but then I'm going to spend months or even years digging into data and progressively refining my sense of what's even the interesting question to answer here. And so looking at infectious disease and thinking that I should be asking a question about regional differences in the United States, and then realizing that the regional story was not at all about regional differences, but was really just a story about racial political economy that was happening all over the country, but had different consequences in the South, where Blacks were the majority of the population, compared to in the North, where they were a small, very subjugated minority. That was sort of a light bulb moment of realizing this whole time I've been looking at this and I wasn't even asking the right thing. And so when I come out all this time later with a story of something that I've figured out, it's not just that my answer is different than I thought, but I'm not even answering the same question that I thought I was going to be addressing. And to me, that's really cool. Like, that's a very fun way to work, because it means that Nothing that I do feels very cookie cutter to me. Everything is sort of built out of this process of discovery. I'm doing a lot of studies of COVID right now. So I'm looking at COVID mortality in Minnesota. Some of the things we've learned so far are that a lot of the mortality inequality is not being captured in the official COVID statistics because it's not necessarily diagnosed COVID deaths. So in particular, there have been a lot of deaths among natives in Minnesota that are not reflected in official COVID statistics. And we don't know yet, are these COVID deaths that were not diagnosed? Are these other kinds of deaths because the medical system shut down? But our research so far is showing that there's a much more complicated story of the pandemic in Minnesota than is understood so far. And we're going to try to unravel that. I'm doing ongoing research about the 1918 influenza pandemic, which is the pandemic that most resembles the one that we're in now. And so it's important to understand how it worked and what carries over and what doesn't carry over. And some of the things that we are starting to find raise a bunch of new questions about the ways that the viruses that you get exposed to very early in your life can affect your immune system for decades after that, which is something that I think in the context of this pandemic are going to be really important questions to unravel.